The B-17 Flying Fortress was the most famous American bomber of the Second World War. The rise of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress to iconic status during the Second World War was marked with tragedy and almost ended Boeing as a company. The Boeing B-17 was built in response to a 1934 request by the U.S. Army Air Corps for strategic bombers. Strategic Command wanted a plane capable of flying at 10,000 feet, at speeds of up to 200 miles per hour, with a range of 2,000 miles. Boeing's prototype Model 299X B-17 outperformed two other entries but crashed, losing the initial 200-bomber contract to the Douglas B-18 Bolo. Still, the Air Corps ordered 13 more B-17s for further evaluation, then introduced it into service in 1938. On the 30th of October 1935, a test flight determining the rate of climb and service ceiling was planned. The command pilot was Major Ployer Peter Hill, Wright Field Material Division Chief of the Flying Branch, his first flight in the Model 299. Co-pilot was Lieutenant Donald Putt, while Boeing Chief Test Pilot Leslie R. Tower was behind the pilots in an advisory role. Also on board were Wright Field Test Observer John Cutting and mechanic Mark Kogler. Tragically, the plane stalled and spun into the ground soon after takeoff, bursting into flames. Though initially surviving the impact, Hill died within a few hours, and Tower on the 19th of November. Post-accident interviews with Tower and Putt determined the control surface gust lock had not been released. Doyle notes, the loss of Hill and Tower, and the Model 299 was directly responsible for the creation of the modern written checklist used by pilots to this day. Army Chief of Staff Marlin Craig cancelled the order for 65 wide B-17s, and ordered 133 of the twin-engine Douglas B-18 Bolo instead. Regardless, the U.S. Air Corps had been impressed by the prototype's performance, and on the 17th of January 1936, through a legal loophole, the Air Corps ordered 13 YB-17s, designated Y-1B-17 after November 1936 to denote its special F-1 funding, for service testing. The YB-17 incorporated a number of significant changes from the Model 299, including more powerful Wright R-1820-39 Cyclone engines. Although the prototype was company-owned and never received a military serial, the B-17 designation itself did not appear officially until January 1936, nearly 3 months after the prototype crashed. The term, XB-17, was retroactively applied to the NX-13372's airframe and has entered the lexicon to describe the first flying fortress. A 14th Y-1B-17, 37-369, originally constructed for ground testing of the airframe's strength, was upgraded by Boeing with exhaust-driven General Electric turbo-superchargers, and designated Y-1B-17A, designed by Dr. Sanford Moss. Engine exhaust gases turned the turbine's steel alloy blades, forcing high-pressure ram air into the Wright Cyclone GR 1820-39 engine supercharger. Scheduled to fly in 1937, it encountered problems with the turbochargers, and its first flight was delayed until the 29th of April 1938. The aircraft was delivered to the Army on the 31st of January 1939. Once service testing was complete, the Y-1B-17s and Y-1B-17A were redesignated B-17 and B-17A, respectively, to signify the change to operational status. Though the crash of the prototype 299 in 1935 had almost wiped out Boeing, now it was seen as a boon. Instead of building models based on experimental engineering, Boeing had been hard at work developing their bomber and now had versions ready for production far better than would have been possible otherwise. One of the most significant weapons of World War II would be ready, but only by a hair. A reporter from the Seattle Times, noting the 13 machine guns in turrets on the upper fuselage, belly, tail, and nose, described it as a flying fortress. Boeing loved the term and immediately trademarked it. Variants AG were produced, 15 variants in total. Of those, the B-17G boasted the largest number produced at 8,860 in total. By the time the definitive B-17G appeared, the number of guns had been increased from 7 to 13, the designs of the gun stations were finalized, and other adjustments were completed. The B-17G was the final version of the Flying Fortress, incorporating all changes made to its predecessor, the B-17F. The bomber usually carried 4,000 pounds of bombs and had a service ceiling over 25,000 feet, with a maximum speed of 287 miles per hour and a range over 2,000 miles. A standard B-17 crew would have 10 total members, with each wearing gear that enabled them to survive inside the unpressurized cabin. The crew would be susceptible to frostbite if their outfit was compromised. There were even reports of gunners getting their fingers cut off because they touched the guns with their bare hands. B-17s made their combat debut with the British Royal Air Force in 1941, but soon saw action with U.S. forces in Europe and the Pacific. The Air Corps, renamed United States Army Air Forces on the 20th of June 1941, used the B-17 and other bombers to bomb from high altitudes with the aid of the then-secret Norden bombsight, known as the Blue Ox, which was an optical electromechanical gyro-stabilized analog computer. The device was able to determine, from variables put in by the bombardier, the point at which the aircraft's bombs should be released to hit the target. The bombardier essentially took over flight control of the aircraft during the bomb run, maintaining a level altitude during the final moments before release. The RAF entered World War II with no heavy bomber of its own in service. In early 1940, the RAF entered into an agreement with the U.S. Army Air Corps to acquire 20 B-17Cs, which were given the service name Fortress I. Their first operation, against Wilhelmshaven on the 8th of July 1941, was unsuccessful. By September, the RAF had lost 8 B-17Cs in combat and had experienced numerous mechanical problems, and Bomber Command abandoned daylight bombing raids using the Fortress I because of the aircraft's poor performance. The experience showed both the RAF and U.S. Air Corps that the B-17C was not ready for combat, and that improved defenses, larger bomb loads and more accurate bombing methods were required. However, the U.S. Air Corps continued using the B-17 as a day bomber, despite misgivings by the RAF that attempts at daylight bombing would be ineffective. The 19th Bombardment Group took delivery of early B-17s prior to the December 7th attack on Pearl Harbor. The 19th Bombardment Group had deployed to Clark Field in the Philippines a few weeks before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor as the first of a planned heavy bomber buildup in the Pacific. Half of the group's B-17s were wiped out on the 8th of December 1941 when they were caught on the ground during refueling and rearming for a planned attack on Japanese airfields on Formosa. The small force of B-17s operated against the Japanese invasion force until they were withdrawn to Darwin, in Australia's Northern Territory. While the B-17 saw service in both Pacific and European theaters, it became the workhorse of the Army Air Corps in Europe. The U.S. Air Corps began building up its air forces in Europe using B-17E soon after entering the war. The first 8th Air Force units arrived in High Wycombe, England, on the 12th of May 1942. To form the 97th Bomb Group. On the 17th of August 1942, 12 B-17Es of the 97th, with the lead aircraft piloted by Major Paul Tibbets and carrying Brigadier General I.I. Eaker as an observer, were close escorted by 4 squadrons of RAF Spitfire Mark 9s. In July 1942, the 97th became the first heavy bombardment group of the 8th Air Force to be deployed to England, where it was based at RAF Polebrook. It had been hastily assembled to meet demands for an early deployment and arrived without any training in the basics of high-altitude daylight bombing. In the first weeks of August 1942, under the tutelage of Royal Air Force veterans, the group received intensive training for its first mission. A 1943 survey by the U.S. Air Corps found that over half the bombers shot down by the Germans had left the protection of the main formation. To address this problem, the United States developed the bomb group formation, which evolved into the staggered combat box formation in which all the B-17s could safely cover any others in their formation with their machine guns. This made a formation of bombers a dangerous target to engage by enemy fighters. In order to more quickly form these formations, assembly ships, planes with distinctive paint schemes, were utilized to guide bombers into formation, saving assembly time. Luftwaffe fighter pilots likened attacking a B-17 combat box formation to encountering a fliegend Stachelschwein, flying porcupine, with dozens of machine guns in a combat box aimed at them from almost every direction. However, the use of this rigid formation meant that individual aircraft could not engage in evasive maneuvers. They had to fly constantly in a straight line, which made them vulnerable to German flak. Moreover, German fighter aircraft later developed the tactic of high-speed strafing passes rather than engaging with individual aircraft to inflict damage with minimum risk. As a result, the B-17's loss rate was up to 25% on some early missions. It was not until the advent of long-range fighter escorts and the resulting degradation of the Luftwaffe as an effective interceptor force between February and June 1944 that the B-17 became strategically potent. Jimmy Doolittle took over command of the mighty 8th Air Force, and his change of bombing tactics and fighter escort tactics drastically changed the survivability of the B-17 over Europe. Doolittle's major influence on the European air war occurred late in 1943, and primarily after he took command of the 8th Air Force on January 6, 1944, when he changed the policy of requiring escorting fighters to remain with their bombers at all times. Instead, he permitted escort fighters to fly far ahead of the bombers' combat box formations, allowing them to freely engage the German fighters lying in wait for the bombers. After the bombers had hit their targets, the American fighters were free to strafe German airfields, transportation, and other targets of opportunity on their return flight to base. These tasks were initially performed with Lockheed P-38 Lightnings and Republic P-47 Thunderbolts through the end of 1943. They were progressively replaced with the long-range North American P-51 Mustangs as the spring of 1944 wore on. Doolittle also relied on Paul Tibbets Jr. that was on his staff and had flown over 43 missions over Europe. Tibbets was instrumental in raising the operating ceiling of B-17s from 6,000 feet to 20,000 feet, out of the effective range of German flak. Tibbets would later be transferred to the Pacific Theater, where he received the Distinguished Service Cross after piloting the famous Enola Gay during the Hiroshima mission. From May 1942 to July 1945, the 8th planned and precisely executed America's daylight strategic bombing campaign against Nazi-occupied Europe, and in doing so the organization compiled an impressive war record. That record, however, carried a high price. For instance, the 8th suffered about half of the U.S. Army Air Force's casualties, 47,483 out of 115,332, including more than 26,000 dead. The 8th's brave men earned 17 Medals of Honor, 220 Distinguished Service Crosses, and 442,000 Air Medals. The 8th's combat record also shows 566 aces, 261 fighter pilots with 31 having 15 or more victories and 305 enlisted gunners, over 440,000 bomber sorties to drop 697,000 tons of bombs, and over 5,100 aircraft losses and 11,200 aerial victories. General Carl Spaatz, the American air commander in Europe, said, "Without the B-17 we may have lost the war." 75 years after the B-17's first flight, an 88-year-old veteran sent the Boeing company a letter. After explaining how he returned to England after a bombing raid over Germany with 179 flak holes and only 2 out of the 4 engines, he wrote, "I'm glad to be alive, thank you for making such a good airplane."